Charlie Freeze had had enough, and it was time he did something about it. He'd been writing for years and got every rejection letter and foreign email one could imagine. His wall was lined with them. He knew the novel he wrote, Sleeping in Dreams, was great, if only someone would actually read it. Not for us, not short enough, long enough, black enough, white enough, or romantic enough. Are there vampires, dragons, wizards? The agents all wrote in varying degrees. No, the piece is not about any of that, Charlie would fume. It was about life and family, love and sickness, joy and laughter, and what makes us who we are. He worked at a local bookstore. Most everyone else who working there was in their late teens or early 20s. He was in his early 50s with wavy gray hair. He had never married. Every night he laid on his twin-sized bed in his small one-bedroom apartment downtown right off the bus route. He believed if he could just become a bestseller, everything would change. Night after night, he wondered how to get on that bestseller list. What do I have to do? For years, people said to be proactive, so he sent the manuscript to over 30 agents and publishers. People then said, you have to write more. So he started a second and a third novel, but knew that first novel was it, the key to the mountaintop, that great American novel to be loved by generations. He thought more about it, coming at it from every angle. Yet he always reached the same conclusion. How do I get it in front of people? That's the only way, he mused. One night, as he lay dozing on his flat and stained pillow, a bell went off in his mind like a buzzer at a game. It was a crazy thought. He had to shake it off, but it loomed larger and larger until his mind couldn't shake it loose, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. That's it, holy moly, that's it. He bolted upright in bed as the box spring creaked in harmony. Millions of people will see it, he said aloud. And so, Charlie Freeze, innocent soul in a world of crooks, began plotting to break into the New York Times. His idea was to plant his name and book title on their bestseller list. It was, in fact, the only way. He had no connections at literary agencies and wasn't in graduate school. He was simply an outsider looking in. He'd worked at printing presses and small publishers over the years, so he knew how they worked. It was foolproof. It was 3 a.m., and he got so excited he stood up and tripped over his startled cat, Felix. He was going to be #1, at least for a day. He paced his apartment back and forth until his mind exhausted itself with this single idea. The next day after work, he took the bus over the Times building dressed like a tourist, wearing a New York City hat, flip-flops, and a camera. He took pictures of buses, cabs, pigeon turds, and most importantly, buildings. He studied the place for weeks, casually eating street meat from every vendor outside the place and getting ill only once. He studied the building and learned that late Saturday night only a skeleton crew worked. He also knew when they took bathroom and smoke breaks. After studying part of the operation, he decided to set the plan in motion and break in. He let one more week go by just to make certain he wanted to do it. He did. At home that following Saturday night, he put on his lucky socks, the ones with the planets on them. They're lucky because he once met Philip Roth on a subway while wearing them. He grabbed a bottle of water and some raisins and stuffed them into his backpack. He also grabbed a bandana. He wasn't exactly sure why, but felt he needed one. In his most sinister mind, he may have to tie someone up. On the bus, he tried to be as inconspicuous as he could, yet his windbreaker swooshed as he walked, and also when he shifted in his seat. He realized the windbreaker was a bad choice for stealth entry, even if it did keep the rain on, though it wasn't raining. However, it might rain, he reckoned. He was just another regular guy prepared for rain. He also happened to be planning to break into the New York Times building. He stepped off the bus at 9:30 p.m. He checked his watch and wandered out front for a few minutes until his cue. The smoke break began and the rear door swung out. A man and woman propped it open with a box and walked off. He needed to get in there fast. The hefty security guard went to the bathroom and with a New York Post in his hand. Easy pickings, Charlie thought. He broke in, or really strolled in past the security booth. He was lost at first, but got his bearings quickly. He heard the press and found the room marked authorized personnel only. Where the printing press hummed and growled, where metal and spindles, paper and ink spun. He found the book review section and stopped the press with the big metal button on the wall. He removed an author who had been on the list 20 times and doesn't even write his own books anymore. So no big loss, thought Charlie. He planted his name and title without much trouble, got the typesetting right, and hit the button to start it again. He moved quickly away from the machine so if caught, no one would know what he was doing. Afterward, he felt satisfied and rummaged around his backpack for the raisins, popping them into his mouth while strolling the hall toward the exit. He admired the great reporters and the New York Times front pages on the walls. The Tiananmen Square photograph caught his eye when another regular-looking guy stood in front of a row of tanks with a bag at his side and a raincoat in his hand. There would be no easy exit for Charlie Freeze, though. Security waited for him around the corner. As he came into view, the guard rushed him and slammed his body against the wall, pressing his face into the Tiananmen Square picture. Charlie appreciated it less this close up. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" the guard demanded in a commanding voice. Guys with backpacks always caused him great alarm. "I love the New York Times and want to be a reporter," Charlie sputtered, trying to throw him off the track. "You should have come on a tour like everyone else." He jammed an elbow into Charlie's back. I mean no harm, he said, frightened. The security guard had seen him on camera in his booth and didn't know if he was a nut or worse. Charlie's mind went blank. He was not by nature deceptive or a liar or even dangerous, but the security guard didn't know that and leaned in harder. He yanked Charlie's arm, cranking it behind his back. The guard then called for backup. He shouted abruptly into his walkie-talkie, "I need help here, Pete. Intruder." "Intruder?" "Yeah, backpack too." Pete, the size of a brown bear, hustled down the hall, and within seconds, the two escorted Charlie into a cement loading dock room. "What's in the backpack?" "Raisins and water." Charlie reached in to show them. Pete stopped him by grabbing his wrist. "Don't do it." Pete grabbed the backpack and looked inside. The two looked at each other, then at the raisins. A few minutes later, the police came to arrest him for breaking and entering. They cuffed and guided him into the patrol car. As he bent to sit, Officer Jeffries guided his head in and was peacefully hauled away. Charlie was in disbelief, sitting in the back of the patrol car like a criminal. But then he reminded himself that he had, in fact, committed a crime. He sunk down in the seat, embarrassed. What would his mother think? He'd never committed a crime in his life. He began hyperventilating, but a small glimmer arose in him, knowing that his secret was safe. He then realized he'd also made a critical mistake. He should have told Tony or someone at work in case things went horribly wrong, as they appeared to be. He was booked at the station, fingerprinted, stripped of his belongings, and put behind bars. He didn't show up at work the next day. The staff worried and called him at home, but no answer. The same thing the following day. Tony, a burly Puerto Rican with a goatee who worked in the stockroom, went to his apartment. He looked around outside, ringing his buzzer over and over again, but no response. Tony was worried, and he was not the worrying type. They had worked together for over 10 years and were the two oldest guys at Open Press Books. After a few days, the bookstore manager, Carl, called the police and eventually found out Charlie was not missing at all, but in fact, in jail. "Okay, officer, thank you." Carl didn't understand. He told Tony and the staff. No one understood. "Why would he break into the Times? It doesn't make sense," Carl said to Tony. "He'd never hurt anyone. If he needed money, he could have asked." He shook his head and they both stood in silence. The next day, as Charlie sat in prison, the newspaper came out and his self-published book started taking off. By the time the paper realized the infraction, it was too late. They couldn't pull the papers from the shelves or trucks. All they could do was offer a correction in Monday's edition. With his one phone call, he called his mother. She would worry not hearing from him after dinner. 3 days later, when Charlie was brought before the judge, his book was still doing well. With the court-appointed attorney at his side, he pleaded guilty for his crime. His mother sat in the front row of the courtroom, shaking her head. She blew her nose loudly into a handkerchief. The gavel fell with a definitive snap. 6 months, take him away. He was to live in a minimum security prison for his first and only crime. She cried as if mourning his death. Not my Charlie, not my sweet boy. She stood as he was escorted away. Tony stood in the back. After a few days languishing in prison, he asked the guard for a New York Times. A few days later, he got one. Checking the bestseller list, he shook his head in disbelief, seeing his name and book title at number 8 a week later. Tony came to visit. None of us can figure out why you did it, bro. Tony was the first person he told. They spoke through the glass. To be on the bestseller list. Tony shook his head. What? To be on the bestseller list. I put my name and book title there. Here, look. Charlie showed Tony the paper from a few days earlier. Tony shook his head and laughed at the absurdity of it. That is the craziest thing I've ever heard, man. You're crazy. Tony loved it and laughed more. You got some balls on you. He kept laughing and held a hand up to his mouth, almost giggling from the sheer brilliance of it. Back in Open Press Books, his coworkers and boss understood. Someone we know made it, Tony said with pride to Janice, another dedicated worker who'd also never received any breaks. The press got a hold of why he broke in. A desperate writer took matters into his own hands to become a New York Times bestseller and landed himself in prison, next on local news, Channel 6. His coworkers watched television in the store's coffee shop. Carl publicly made an announcement to the staff, summarily saying, "We cannot condone such behavior. Now please get back to work." Secretly, Charlie was applauded. After the report ended, the reporter off camera said, "I love this. A win for the little guy." He had the book sitting next to him on his desk. The store promptly began displaying the book in the window. Lines formed. People from the neighborhood recognized him and wanted to buy the book. The store had not been doing well because of the chain store in the nearby mall. "That's Charlie, Mom," one young teen who often hung out at the store shouted to his single mother in their small, outdated kitchen. They watched the news together during dinners. She thought the news would broaden him and give him a better understanding of the world. But she was confused about this and what lesson it would impart to her fatherless boy. Much of the neighborhood rallied behind Charlie. Of course, some thought he should have been more patient, should have played by the rules and not done it. He should have been arrested, some shouted. Breaking and entering, ridiculous. What a fool, they said, and shook their heads in judgment. A few weeks later, his story made it to the national news. Up next, writer arrested. The story wasn't about corrupt politicians or the threat of war. Instead, struggling author Charlie Fries went to extremes to get on the New York Times bestseller list. How? Stay tuned. In prison, the 6 months passed slowly. Charlie was scared of the noises at night, the locking of cell doors, and the harshness in some inmates' eyes. He was a private person. Now even his going to the bathroom was on public display. He longed for the quiet of his small apartment. He didn't belong, and yet here he was, often thinking about what he did. Was it worth the doubt I now feel about myself? When his sentence was complete, he would have to face the public, his mother, his friends. This kept him lying sleepless in his cell at night. Would they look at me the same? Would their smiles hide their doubts? Would they turn their backs on me? He played Scrabble to pass the time. His mother and a few coworkers visited, while others came to see him that he did not know. Dante, a skinny black inmate with glasses, warned him, "You're famous, man. People are going to try to take what you got." Charlie puzzled over this. No one had ever wanted what he got. Sleeping in Dreams didn't just stay on the New York Times bestseller list for a day, but days, then weeks, and months. On his first day back, Charlie headed straight to the bookstore. He looked in the window, yet wanted to be inside. A coworker saw him lingering and pulled him in. They all came and gave him hugs. Tony too. Carl offered him his job back. Standing there, Charlie realized, bestseller or not, he'd never be part of the in crowd, and that was okay. The bookstore was his family and home. His royalty checks awaited him at the post office. He stared at the large numbers, then stuffed the checks in his pocket. There were also letters from agents clamoring for his attention. All he ever wanted to be was acknowledged, yet he decided to ignore them as they had ignored him, and threw the letters into the recycling bin. He walked the streets confused. Has everything changed? Everything but me? Charlie was an honest guy who did a dishonest deed. I'm a thief and a child. He beat himself up. He walked all the way to his mother's, halfway across the city. People loved the book, and that was most important to Charlie. He would find healing in reaching others. The result was worth the indiscretion, he resolved. He started back at work the next day and also started a follow-up novel, In Dreams I Am Awake. Today he doesn't have to break into the Times to get on their list, but he wouldn't rule it out. Wow, okay.
It's like it's perfect, it's a perfect success story.
Yeah.
But I wanted to just have you talk a little bit about this leap that you took from, day job to writer and what that was like, being a bestseller on Amazon.
Well, it was a short-lived bestseller, small category, but it was nice for a little while, I'll tell you that. It was a hard decision. I was working at a company, steady paycheck, and but yeah, I was just ill every day, dreaded it. It was just an awful experience, and at the same time, couldn't write that much because I was doing something that was really depleting my energy and was sort of against who I was. So this was actually during the worst of the Depression, 08, 09. I didn't have much money, but I just said, screw it, I need to do this. So I gave notice, and some of my friends even mocked me, like, this is the worst economy in years, you're going to quit a job? And I said, yes, I don't care what the economy's doing. So I think, for years, it's funny, I was wanting to get out of the job, and I didn't know how to. I kept asking myself, when can I leave, when can I leave? And eventually a voice just said, all right, you paid the price, So I did, and I worked feverishly on the novel, The Reluctant Human, which there's a lot of pain and agony in it, but sort of a catharsis for the protagonist, who basically finds the way back to himself after bad decisions. So it was hard, initially leaving, and then, obviously you don't have a lot of money, it's hard to do certain things, but it was the right move, and it allowed me to write a lot, and I probably wrote 10 hours a day or something, just possessed, and I was determined to finish the first draft of it before New Year's of the same year, and I think at 11:58 I finished the, so it needed work, but so yeah, and I'm working again full time, and met an amazing woman, and needed to do that, but it's a much better job that I'm at.
Great. Well, your success story, personally, I think is as exciting as the story that we just heard. But thank you for coming out.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.